It's Byron again. Still talking about foundations, and when I think of foundations, I think about how did things begin in the beginning, or what was the very beginning of how things looked or came about when the world began, and how God dealt with people. So we've been in Genesis, and in Genesis, actually, we're in Romans, trying to get through Romans, but we got to the part where people started worshiping creeping things and things like that, and I felt like we needed to go to Genesis. So here we are in Genesis, and we got through Genesis 6, or almost through Genesis 6, up until the point of the flood. Now, I'm not going to cover everything in the flood, but I do want to cover some points here that I think are key. And Noah was, the Bible states that Noah was perfect in his generations, found grace in the eyes of the Lord. He and his son, Ham, Shem, and Japheth, went into the ark with their wives, and two of each kind of animal, except for the clean animals, and there were certain animals. There were 7 of those. I'm not sure I got that exactly right, but there were 7 of certain types. Some people believe that was for sacrifices to be offered after the flood. But let's go to Genesis chapter 7. Let's read a portion here that's very critical, and I'll tell you why it's critical after I read this. But in Genesis chapter 7, verse 17 through 22, let me read that, and then I'll go over the criticality of that point. And the flood was 40 days upon the earth, and the waters increased and bare up the ark. And it was lifted up above the earth, and the waters prevailed and were increased greatly upon the earth. And the ark went upon the face of the waters. And the waters prevailed exceedingly upon the earth, and all the high hills that were upon the whole heaven were covered, that were under the whole heaven were covered. 15 cubits upward did the waters prevail, and the mountains were covered. And all flesh died that moved upon the earth, both of fowl and of cattle, and of beast, and of every creeping thing that creepeth upon the earth, and every man, all in whose nostrils was the breath of life. Of all that was in the dry land died. Now that's the Bible record. Now that particular record, a lot of people would say, that particular record is true. The reason I bring that up as a point is that I personally believe that particular record. But let me tell you, that particular record is not true in everyone's mind, although they would not come out and tell you that. And let me just give you a couple keywords here. You can start doing some looking into it. But there are those who talk about Atlantis, the lost continent of Atlantis, and then there's shows that you see on television. And this is, if you look in Revelation, I think it's chapter 18, it talks about Mystery Babylon. And Mystery Babylon was able to deceive all the nations. And let me just show you part of that deception. There's talk of this lost continent of Atlantis. And then you see shows out there that are starting to show you that there's actually underwater cities here in the earth. And many times these are very highly advanced looking civilizations that existed. And personally, I think Atlantis is actually referring to the pre-flood world. But there are some that also think that there are survivors of Atlantis or the pre-flood era, and they actually call them Aryan. Now, if you trace the Aryan name or the Aryan word, you'll find out it's been the source of a lot of contention or a lot of strife in the world. So the Aryan race, being the race that survived the flood, or the Great Deluge, as they like to say, was very contentious during World War II, and also has a play today. So just some keywords I just want to throw out there. I'm not tremendously knowledgeable on this, But when I hear things and it rings a bell with me, I start going, and I start building these little pieces, and I'm like, okay, that fits, that fits, that fits. So just because this Bible says that doesn't mean everybody in the world believes that. And then you start realizing, well, what if a lot of what I'm watching and a lot of what I'm reading is there intentionally to lead me to believe something else could be true. And that's in fact the purpose of those things is to get you to believe or to deceive so that you would believe a lie. And that's active in the world today. All the nations will be deceived. And that's just a small portion of the deception. But a portion of it anyway. I want to move on to Genesis chapter 9 and talk another point here that happened after the flood, and eventually we're going to probably end up in chapter 11. Just reading portions of these to get to a certain point of the Tower of Babel, and then I'm going to end in Genesis for the moment. In chapter 9, verse 20, it says, "And Noah began to be a husbandman, and he planted a vineyard, and he drank of the wine, and was drunken, and he was uncovered in his tent, naked in his tent. And Ham, the father of Canaan, saw the nakedness of his father, and told his two brethren without. And Shem and Japheth took a garment, and laid it over their shoulders, and went backward, and covered the nakedness of their father. And their faces were backward, and they saw not their father's nakedness. And Noah awoke from his wine, and knew what his younger son had done unto him. And he said, Cursed be Canaan." Now, Ham actually did this. Ham was the father of Canaan. Noah said, "Cursed be Canaan," who is the son of Ham, who did this. "A servant of servants shall he be unto his brethren." And he said, "Blessed be the Lord God of Shem, and Canaan shall be his servant. God shall enlarge Japheth, and he shall dwell in the tents of Shem, and Canaan shall be his servant." And Noah lived after the flood 150 years. Now later in chapter 10, you read, now Ham is the one that did that, and cursed be Canaan, but then later you read, the sons of Ham were Cush, Mizraim, Phut, and Canaan. And then Cush begot Nimrod, and Nimrod is a very important figure. So let's read about why the Bible in these genealogies somehow jumps out and distinguishes a difference between Nimrod. If you remember back earlier in Genesis, we talked about Lamech, and there was some dialogue about Lamech a little more than most people. A lot of times these genealogies are like, he begat so-and-so, and they begat so-and-so, and then occasionally you get some dialogue about them. So let's read a little about Nimrod here, because Nimrod's, the description of him stands out kind of like it did Lamech. "And Cush begot Nimrod. He began to be a mighty one in the earth. He was a mighty hunter before the Lord. Before it was said, even as Nimrod, the mighty hunter before the Lord. And the beginning of his kingdom was Babel, and Erech, and Akkad, and I'm going to butcher these names, and I apologize for that, Calneh, in the land of Shinar. Out of that land went forth Asher, and builded Nineveh, and the city, Rehoboth, and Calah, and Rezin between Nineveh and Calah. The same is a great city." Now, if you just take this for how it's written and all that stuff, you can see a comparison between this and what Cain did. Cain, after he went out of the presence of the Lord, he built a city and named it after his son Enoch, which is not to be confused with the Enoch who walked with God and was no more. Well, now we're after the flood, and there's some folks that are of the line now from Noah who are now cursed, or Ham has done this with Noah, and there's been a curse similar to just before the flood, or before the flood, with God doing to Cain. And suddenly you have this one dialogue here in the Bible where there's a standout. There's a Nimrod who begins to build a kingdom, and it's made up of many cities and all that stuff. And he's a mighty hunter before the Lord. There's some speculation as to what exactly mighty hunter means and all that. I'm going to leave the speculation alone. I would think that it could apply to both hunter of animals and also hunter of men, or tyranny, or something like that, just as we talked about earlier with Cain. Going to Genesis 11, verse 1. Let's look at what else the Bible said. And the whole earth was of one language and of one speech. And it came to pass, as they journeyed from the east, that they found a plain in the land of Shinar, and they dwelt there. And they said one to another, Go to, let us make brick and burn them thoroughly. And they had brick for stone, and slime they had for mortar. And they said, Go to, let us build us a city and a tower whose top may reach into heaven. And let us make us a name, lest we be scattered abroad upon the face of the whole earth. And the Lord came down to see the city and the tower which the children of men builded. And the Lord said, Behold, the people is one, and they have all one language. And this he began to do. And now nothing will be restrained from them which they have imagined to do. Go to, let us go down, and there confound their language, that they may not understand one speech. I'm going to leave this one kind of short. Just going to leave you with these thoughts. But I want you to look there in Genesis 11, verse 6. And toward the end it says, nothing will restrain them which they have imagined. And go back just before the flood, and it says, every imagination of man's heart was evil. A rhyme in the language or whatever, but at this time in history, at this point, God saw something that required this to be stopped. Now, I know what I think it is, and I'm going to talk about it later. But God saw something in man's heart that required stopping it. And personally, I'm going to tell you, it's a one world government. And it's interesting that they were making bricks, or they were masons, and they were using it to build. And you can trace kingdoms. If you just look, and you just look around, even in the world today, if you look around at elaborate stone or brick buildings, you'll notice that those things that are made of, with stone or brick or whatever, do have to do with governmental institutions or organizations that do impact that. So I'm going to leave that right there. This is actually the Genesis portion that I wanted to get to. Next, I'm going to go ahead and define some more things about people that worship man, creeping things, animals, and things like that. But that is the Genesis story that is revealed in the Bible that talks about that. Later on in the Bible, you'll see them talking about certain names of gods, and we can tie all that back to these two stories right here, or the pre-flood and the post-flood times of Cain, that line, and also Nimrod. All this, and in every mythological story that you hear, whether it is in South America or whether it's in Egypt or India, the religions of the world, they all have a central origin. They all have very much similarities. And when this one world government does take place, it will be very easy for there to be a one world religion because of the similarity. Now, God scattered them at the time of the flood. They haven't been able to communicate that well between each other. But there's organizations that have been holding this thing together for many years. So, just a note there, we're going to move out of Genesis. We'll refer back to it, but we'll move out of Genesis from this point and get back into Romans and continue on. But the Apostle Paul in Romans, when he talked about people that worship creeping things and gods and things other than God, the one true God, he was no novice in what he was talking about. He knew the lineage or the line of all these things that have happened, and these things can be traced all the way back to the very beginnings of the earth. Just look at some of the films that they have today on pre-flood cities that are maybe found underwater, and you'll see gods, images made, creeping things. Some of the National Geographic things, you'll see these images, and it started back when Cain went out of the presence of the Lord. They began to make, gods of men, most particularly gods of their governmental leaders or their tyrants. And unfortunately, the people at the time had to be pulled out of that system. And the next few chapters of Genesis will show you that Abram was pulled out of what I'll go ahead and say is that Babylonian system. And God has said, come out of Mystery Babylon. And that's what he's calling us to do today. We're born into it today, and we need to come out of it. And the only way to come out of it is to unplug from today's system. We're inundated from every facet of life by Mystery Babylon. Thank you.